And now, please welcome to the stage Alexia Lartartu, Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Development, U.S. Department of the Treasury.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you still have your coffee and tea and are staying with us. I'm really delighted to be here at EXIM's 2022 annual conference, A Brighter Future Through Exporting. I'm here representing the U.S. Treasury, one of the alphabet soup, quoting Undersecretary Lago, agencies of the U.S. government. And Secretary Yellen of the Treasury sends her regards to all of you. Chair Lewis, you do put on quite a convening, and I think it's a reflection of EXIM's critical role as a part of the USG toolkit to help increase climate finance, to help move forward clean energy and invest in infrastructure. Now, the chair has asked me to reflect a little bit on COP27. I imagine many of you were there as well. And so I'd like to share with you two takeaways. The first takeaway is that the conversations, both officially and in the hallways that I heard, focused a lot on the global macroeconomic situation, on inflation, on the triple shocks of energy, food, and fertilizer, on the recovery from COVID, and on the desperate need for more financing to help the energy transition and the climate transition. So that's all quite sobering. My second takeaway, however, is far more optimistic, and that is there was an absolute consensus from all the countries that I spoke to that the North Star is a brighter future, and a brighter future is a future that is clean, that is green, that is net zero, and that is resilient. The challenge, however, is how do we get to this brighter future? And in that context, there were discussions about, particularly when talking about emerging markets and about Africa, that we need to talk about access to energy as much as we talk about clean energy and energy security. That we must focus urgently on building infrastructure to boost productivity, accelerate growth, and make sure that citizens can have access to basic services that they are absolutely demanding. And that this infrastructure yet to be built must be low carbon and must be resilient. There was a lot of talk about the fact that climate is not something that sits on its side, but that affects almost every single sector of the economy, including, very importantly, agriculture and health. There was a lot of talk about technology and that we need to scale up the deployment of new technologies, including technologies that have not yet been invented, perhaps, to make this transition possible. And finally, there was a lot of talk about the fact that the transition must be just. It must leave no one behind, which means we need new green jobs. So against this rather complex background, with a note of optimism, but also a sobering note, the United States showed up at COP27. We showed up strong. We showed up ready to lead, to advocate, to help finance, to listen to countries, and to bring in the private sector. We discussed quite a bit the United States' historic domestic climate investments, including the Inflation Reduction Act, $270 billion in clean energy-related tax incentives. The Inflation Reduction Act has a number of provisions that will contribute to the growth of clean energy sector globally. It will lead to a massive build-out of renewable power, helping to reduce costs by scaling deployment, learning by doing, and benefiting from economies of scale. And this will lead to cost reductions around the entire renewable energy value chain. And the Inflation Reduction Act also has wage and apprenticeship provisions, bonuses for investing in low-income communities. And this again gets to the just piece. President Biden, who came and spoke at COP, also pledged to double the US contribution to the Adaptation Fund to $100 million. He also pledged to provide $150 million in new support to accelerate adaptation and resilience across Africa. And then Treasury specifically focused on international climate finance through the private sector and through the public sector as well. I'd like to quickly share with you 3 ways that Treasury is trying to do our bit in all of this. The first one is in supporting a new innovative model that we call the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. It's a model that aims to support high-emitting developing countries that have a clear and strong political commitment to accelerate their transition from carbon-intensive energy sectors, particularly coal, to renewables. In return for accelerated ambition, the US and all parts of the US government, along with international partners, including the G7 but other countries, commit to pooling together public financing, private financing, and philanthropic financing. So for example, at COP27, South Africa and the international donor group, including the United States, endorsed South Africa's Just Energy Transition Partnership Investment Plan. And this was building on the COP26 announcement of $8.5 billion to support South Africa in return for their more ambitious NDC. At COP27, we finalized negotiations for a similar partnership with Indonesia. This was led by the United States and Japan. And at the G20, we announced the launch of this partnership with a $20 billion package over 3 to 5 years, combining both public and private financing in return for quite amazing climate ambition from the Indonesian government. Thanks to these partnerships, there is enormous potential for the United States private sector and the private sector from around the world to support the transition to renewable energy in South Africa and in Indonesia. And these are just one example of ways that we can work. Scott Nathan and others already also mentioned the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, the PGII, which is a G7-led whole-of-government initiative that aims to mobilize $600 billion in private and public capital for emerging markets. Treasury leads on helping to mobilize private capital and on getting the multilateral development banks to do their parts in this regard. And I think it will be really key to have the smart use of concessional financing to help change the risk-return calculation that will then make it possible for the private sector to come in to finance critical infrastructure projects. Finally, the US Treasury is working very hard with a broad coalition of shareholders to really push the multilateral development banks to meet the evolving needs of our world today. We're taking a fresh look at the operating models of these institutions to stretch their existing capital to better crowd in the private sector and mobilize the large pools of private savings for priority investments, including in infrastructure. This can be through more innovative blending platforms, through the more sophisticated use of instruments like guarantees, insurance, and reinsurance, by helping to promote more green and sustainably linked bonds, by thinking very hard about risk sharing and how the MDBs can cycle off their assets once the risk return profile is such that the private sector might take over these assets, and of course, continuing to work on the very important policy enabling environment. Now, I talked about a lot of what's being done, but I have to say, to achieve our goals, we need an all-hands-on-deck approach. And so official export credits have an important role in helping to stimulate international trade in climate-related technologies and to fill the market gaps where the commercial lending may be scarce. to meet the International Energy Association's climate finance targets by the end of the decade, export credit agencies, globally must increase their annual spending on climate investment 7-fold by some assessments. And so given this urgency, EXIM's leadership is essential to both exiting the carbon-intensive economy and financing transitional technologies to support a low-carbon and bright future. In particular, EXIM has a role by mitigating country and buyer risks and by providing long-term financing tenures to scale up renewable energy use in developing economies, including in Africa. And so I really wish you, EXIM, continued strong work as you look to 2023 and strong partnerships with all of the US agencies, with the private sector, and very much hand in hand with our partners in the emerging market so that we can make a brighter future a true reality. Thank you so much.